USDA Government Inspected. All of our essays tell a story, and this one is no exception. But our present tale, by its very nature, partakes in large measure of the epic and the symbolic. It is a political tale compiled largely from the accounts of politicians and the journalists who write about politicians, which is to say it possesses much of the charm and innocence of a good, robust fairy tale. As we shall shortly discover, there are logical reasons for such larger-than-life overtones, and they deserve serious scrutiny. But the story must come first. An exciting tale of a bold president, an earnest reformer, some evil political bosses, and a lot of pork and beef. It begins, once upon a time, with the president, Teddy Roosevelt, who turns out to be the hero of the tale. There was nothing ordinary about Teddy, including the fact that he was ever president at all. People from the Roosevelt social class disdained politics and would never encourage their sons to take it up as a profession. But then again, Teddy was not like other members of his social class, nor his fellow students at Harvard. Anything he did with gusto, and if being the best meant being president, then Teddy would not stop short of the White House. His path to success was not an easy one. As a child, Teddy was sickly, asthmatic, and nearsighted. He spent long hours pummeling punching bags, swinging on parallel bars, doing push-ups, and boxing in the ring to build a body as active as his mind. When he went west in the 1880s to take up ranching, he had to overcome his image as an effete Eastern dude. He soon amazed many a grizzly cowboy by riding the Dakota Badlands in spring mud, blasts of summer heat, and driving winter storms. He fought with his fists and once rounded up a band of desperados at gunpoint. Back east, when Teddy played tennis, he showed the same determination, his record being 91 games in a single day. When he led the Rough Riders through Cuba in the Spanish-American War in 1898, he raised troop morale by walking the sentry line, whistling cheerfully while his men crouched low to avoid the bullets flying overhead. As president, he advised others to speak softly and carry a big stick, though he himself more often observed only the latter half of his maxim. Teddy's favorite expressions, seldom spoken softly, were bully and delighted, uttered because he usually got his way. By 1906, Teddy and had the White House firmly in his grasp. Just 2 years earlier, he had engineered an impressive victory to become president in his own right. He had behind him a record of achievements to which he would soon add the Nobel Peace Prize for his role in bringing an end to the Russo-Japanese War. But Teddy could never rest on his laurels. In February, a storm broke that challenged his skill as leader both of the nation and of the Republican Party. The thunderclap that shattered the calm was the publication of The Jungle. The book told a lurid tale about Chicago's meatpacking industry. Its author, Upton Sinclair, was not only a reformer, but a socialist as well. Most Americans of the day believed that socialists were subversives who held extreme and impractical opinions. Despite that skepticism, readers could not ignore the grisly realities accounted in The Jungle. It related in often revolting detail the conditions under which the packers processed pork and beef, adulterated it, and shipped it to millions of American consumers. Breakfast sausage, Sinclair revealed, was more than a tasty blend of ground meats and spices. It was too dark in these storage spaces to see clearly, he reported, but a man could run his hand over the piles of meat and swap off handfuls of dried dung of rats. These rats were nuisances, and the packers would put out poisoned beef for them. They would die, and then the rats, bread, and meat would go into the hoppers together. This is no fairy story or no joke. The meat would be shoveled into carts, and the man who did the shoveling did not trouble to lift out even a rat if he saw one. Rats were but one tasty additive in the meat sent to dinner tables. Potted chicken contained no chicken at all, only beef suet, waste ends of veal and tripe. Most shocking of all, Sinclair told men in cooking rooms who fell into vats, and after being cooked for days, all but the bone had gone into the world as Durham's pure beef and lard. So these are people, guys who fell in there. In just 1 week, a scandalized public had snapped up some 25,000 copies of The Jungle. Almost all of those readers missed the socialist message. Sinclair had hoped to draw their attention to the conditions under which the toilers get their bread. The public had responded instead to the disclosures about corrupt federal meat inspectors, unsanitary slaughterhouses, tubercular cattle, and the packers' unscrupulous business practices. One of the most outraged readers was President Theodore Roosevelt. Few politicians have ever been as well informed as TR, who devoured books at over 1,500 words per minute, published works of history, and corresponded regularly with leading business, academic, and public figures. Roosevelt recognized immediately that the public would expect government at some level, local, state, or federal, to clean up the meat industry. He invited Sinclair for a talk at the White House, and though he dismissed the writer's pathetic belief in socialism, he promised that the specific evils you point out shall, if their persistence be proved, and if I have the power, it will be eradicated. Roosevelt kept his promise. With the help of allies in Congress, he quickly brought out a new bill, along with the proverbial big stick. Only 4 months later, on June 30th, he signed into law the Meat Inspection Act that banned the packers from using any unhealthy dyes, chemical preservatives, or adulterants. The bill provided $3 million towards a new, tougher inspection system, where government inspectors could be on hand day or night to condemn animals unfit for human consumption. Senator Albert Beveridge of Indiana, Roosevelt's progressive ally in Congress, gave the president credit for the new bill. It is chiefly to him that we owe the fact that we will get as excellent a bill as we will have, he told reporters. Once again, Americans could put canned meats and sausages on the dinner table and eat happily ever after. Or so it would seem. The symbol of politics. The story you have just read is true, as far as it goes. If it is taken on a legendary, even mythic quality in the telling, that is understandable, given the nature of the American political system. Politics is, after all, public business, and the tales of national politics almost inescapably takes on epic proportions. In such situations, symbolic language serves to simplify highly complex realities. It makes them more comprehensible by substituting concrete and recognizable actors or objects in the place of complicated, though often banal, situations. In doing so, symbols and symbolic language serve as a means of communication between political leaders and their constituencies, the people. Skillful politicians generally have the ability to cast their actions in dramatic terms that speak to deeply felt public concerns. You're going to see a lot of this in the elections this year. Jacksonian Democrats pioneered many of the modern uses of campaign imagery. They touted their candidate, Old Hickory, as a symbolic embodiment of the American frontier tradition. In their hands, Jackson became the uncommon common man. As president, he waged war against the second bank of the United States, fittingly symbolized by its enemies as the Monster Bank. His Whig opposition had quickly grasped the use of such symbols. They nominated a popular general of their own, William Henry Tippecanoe Harrison. Their campaign rhetoric invoked the log cabin motif and other appropriate frontier images, even though Harrison came from a distinguished Virginia family and lived in an elegant house. Thus, along with a two-party system of politics, Americans had developed a body of symbols to make complex political issues familiar and comprehensive to voters. Symbols as a mode of political discourse took on a new meaning with an art form that reached maturity in the late 19th century, the political cartoon. Earlier cartoonists had portrayed Old Hickory's epic struggle with the Monster Bank, but they lacked the sophistication and draftsmanship achieved by Gilded Age caricaturists like Thomas Nast. Week after week, newspapers carried cartoons which established readily identifiable symbols. Nast conceived the elephant as a representation of the grand old party, the Republicans, and the donkey for the Democrats. To Nast and his fellow cartoonists, we owe our image of the political boss, decked out in its gaudy suit that assumes a striking resemblance to a convict's striped outfit. So too, the monopolist or greedy capitalist, his huge bloated waistline taking on the aspect of a bag of silver dollars. A scraggly beard, overalls, and wild, crazy-eyed denoted the populist. In place of the Monster Bank stood the Trust, vividly pictured as a grasping octopus. Such cartoons, by their very nature, communicated the political symbolism of their day. The cartoonist seldom had a better subject than Teddy Roosevelt, with his gleaming, oversized front teeth, bull neck, pince nez glasses, and of course his big stick. Caricaturists did not have to stretch the imagination much to cast Teddy larger than life. He specialized in that department long before he reached the White House. There was the gun-toting cowboy, the New York police commissioner in his long black cape, and his Rough Rider charging up San Juan Hill. Thus it was easy during the political battles of the Progressive era to conceive of the actors in symbolic terms. In one corner stood the reformers, Roosevelt, a policeman clubbing the opposition with his big stick, or Sinclair, wild-eyed like all political radicals. In the other corner, during the meat inspection fight, stood the Beef Trust, Armour, Swift, and the other packers, bloated by their ill-gotten gains. Yet, as we have already noted, such symbolic representation inevitably oversimplify the political process to the point of distortion. As rendered by the cartoonists, shades of gray become black and white, and political conflict becomes a Manichaean struggle between good and evil. Even more subtly, distortion arises because symbols come to personalize complex situations and processes. Inanimate institutions, trusts, political machines, Congress, appear as animate objects, a grasping octopus, predatory tigers, braying donkeys, with human motives and designs. Consequently, we tend to visualize political events as being primarily the result of individuals' actions. The story of the meat inspection law is reduced to the tale of Roosevelt, Sinclair, and their enemies. The progression, as we saw, is quite simple. 1. Sinclair's revelations scandalize the president. 2. Roosevelt determines to reform the law. 3. With his usual energy, he overwhelms the opposition and saves the consumer. Such an explanation masks the crucial truth that the actors, whether individuals, groups, or institutions, often have mixed motives and multiple objectives. The outcome of a situation may bear slight resemblance to the original design of any of the participants. As a result, symbolic explanations do not adequately portray the labyrinth of negotiations and institutional hurdles that shape the political process, sometimes to the point of determining the outcome. I'm going to flip. Next page is a picture of the characteristics on page 240. Here we go. Political historians, then, must handle symbolic language and explanations with caution. They cannot simply dismiss or debunk the symbolism, for it can, by influencing opinion, affect the political process. At the same time, historians cannot allow symbols to obscure the information necessary to narrate and explain political events. Granted that Roosevelt played the reformer in seeking to curb the Packers' worst abuses, how successfully did he translate his intentions into an effective political instrument? Senator Beveridge, it is true, praised both the new law and the president's role in securing its passage. Yet other supporters of the inspection reform did not share Beveridge's enthusiasm. The American consumer and the ordinary American farmer have been left out of the question, Senator Newt Nelson complained shortly after the act passed. I must say I feel completely disappointed. When I go home, I will go home like a licked dog. In fact, prominent Republicans in the Senate, led by Beveridge himself and Roosevelt's good friend Henry Cabot Lodge of Massachusetts, had fought to defeat the law only a few days before Roosevelt signed it. They believed, as Nelson had argued, that the bill was intended to placate the packers, to make the meat packers happy. Next to placate the men who raise cattle, and third, to get a good market for the packers abroad. In short, many senators viewed the Meat Inspection Act as a victory for the packers and a defeat for reform. In that light, Beveridge's praise has a symbolic meaning that our story thus far cannot explain. So the historian must seek to set aside the mythic story and its symbols in order to reconstruct the institutional setting in which the real story unfolded. Individual actions must be made to square with motives. The outcome must be treated not as the inevitable triumph of good over evil, but as just one of the many possible outcomes, and not necessarily the best one at that. It is also the political historian's task to determine how the complex procedural tangle by which a bill becomes law limits the impact of individual actors, no matter how lofty or base their motives are. So we have the fairy tale story of the reformer who writes an expose story of the jungle, the heroic president who pushes forward legislation to regulate the industry, and we have the Meat Inspection Act, and now the food is safe to eat. What this guy is saying, what Littell and Davidson are saying, is this much more complicated than that. And the symbolism of the fairy tale needs to be dived deeper into. So here we go. The tangle behind the jungle. The mythic tale of the Meat Inspection Act begins with the publication of The Jungle in February 1906. That, so the story goes, was the catalytic event that sparked outrage against the packers and their unscrupulous methods. Yet, while The Jungle certainly provoked a public outcry, we may legitimately wonder whether a single dramatic story could by itself generate such widespread controversy. For better or worse, we have no Gallup polls from 1906 to measure public response to Claire's lurid expose. But if we poke around in earlier stories about the meat industry, we find that The Jungle was merely a final straw, albeit a weighty one, in a long train of unfavorable publicity directed against the meat packers. As early as the 1870s, some European governments had begun to ban importation of what they had found were unhealthy American meat products. Over the years, American exports declined as the Europeans tightened their restrictions. In 1891, the worried packers persuaded Congress to pass a federal meat inspection act in order to win back their foreign customers. So these are the meat packers persuading Congress to pass meat inspection reform. The federal stamp would show that all meats in interstate and foreign sales had been subjected to an ante-mortem inspection, a pre-slaughter inspection. That measure succeeded until 1897, when the embalmed meat scandals once again tarnished the industry's reputation. The embalmed meat, literally, they were putting embalming fluids on the meat to prevent them from rotting. The meat packers who had supplied the American soldiers fighting in Cuba had sold the Army quantities of rotten and chemically adulterated meats. As the commander of the Rough Riders, Colonel Teddy Roosevelt had seen more troops die from poisonous meats than from Spanish bullets. That issue still ranked in 1902 when he discovered collusion between the packers and railroads pushing meat prices up. In 1905, he found an opportunity to punish the packers. He ordered his attorney general to bring suit against the Packing House Trust under the Sherman Antitrust Act. The president was particularly offended by the packers' brazen disregard for public safety. In building their industry into one of the nation's 10 largest, Armour, Swift, and others boasted openly that they were using every bit of the pig, quote, except the squeal. Roosevelt was therefore beside himself when he heard that the judge had dismissed the government suit on narrow procedural grounds. Suspicious that the packers had bribed the judge, he instructed his attorney general to release a confidential report revealing perjury in the beef trust case. Roosevelt scarcely needed to read The Jungle to believe that with their public be damned attitude, the meat barons might be guilty of any manner of irresponsible behavior. The Jungle merely provided a new weapon for his ongoing fight. Furthermore, the president recognized that the existing meat inspection law left much to be desired. Under it, Congress allocated money for an inspection force, but those appropriations were usually horribly inadequate. Given the limited funds, most inspectors worked only during the day, leaving the packers free to commit their worst abuses at night. Even if inspectors did find diseased cattle at the pre-slaughter inspection, they had no power to have the animals destroyed. In fact, the packers made considerable profit selling those tainted animals to other plants not under federal inspection. The federal government actually had no authority over the packers. Nothing under the system forced compliance with government standards. The inspectors could only threaten to leave the premises and take their stamps with them if the packers ignored the rulings. And though the law did prevent the industry from exporting meat without the federal stamp of approval, there was no similar provision to protect American consumers. Once a carcass passed the inspector, the government had no further power to impose sanitary standards anywhere in the plants. Roosevelt was aware of these deficiencies and eager to see them corrected. The public, too, had grounds for suspicion even before The Jungle hit the bookstores. Sinclair's accusations had already been published in an obscure socialist journal. In doing his research, Sinclair had received information from The Lancet, a distinguished British medical journal which had investigated earlier meat industry scandals. In 1905, The Lancet renewed its investigation of packing house filth, which jeopardized both workers and consumers. At the same time, Samuel Merwin, a well-known muckraking journalist, had written articles charging the packers with deliberately selling diseased meats. To understand the impact of The Jungle, the historian must place it in the context of the popular muckraking style of journalism. Having discovered that the public possessed an almost insatiable appetite for sensational stories, leading journalists had set out to investigate corruption wherever they could find it. They had exposed the boss-dominated urban political machines, graft in government, greedy senators, Wall Street stock frauds, prostitution, quack doctors, patent medicines, women's inequality, child labor issues, dangerous factory conditions, and a host of other social ills. The muckrakers had much in common with the political cartoonists. Their villains made convenient, easily recognizable symbols. Evil could be personified as the monster trust, the self-serving politician, or the avaricious capitalist. Such an approach, while gratifying readers' love of lurid details, seldom got to the heart of the social problems. In their indignant style, muckrakers told Americans what was wrong with their society, but not how the problems arose, nor what could be done. Somehow, the exposure of the symptoms of the evil was supposed to motivate reformers and an aroused public to cure the disease. In keeping with the popular style of muckraking, Sinclair had pointed an accusing finger at the packers without offering any specific suggestions for cleaning up the meat industry. But just as The Jungle could be understood only within the context of the larger muckraking style, so too the Meat Inspection Act stood within the context of progressive reform. Despite Sinclair's lack of analysis, there were many Americans who had identified the sources of such corporate arrogance and who had prepared an agenda for politics. Theodore Roosevelt embodied much of the temperament of those progressive reformers. He shared their hostility to excessive concentrations of power in private hands, their approval of executive regulatory agencies, their faith in democratic forms of government, their humanitarian sensibilities, and their overriding confidence in the people's capacity to shape their future intelligently. The progressives were actually a diverse group seeking to turn government at all levels into a weapon for social justice. They included rural reformers, good government and moral uplift advocates, economic regulators, antitrusters, and political liberals and conservatives. Roosevelt's conservative faith in traditional institutions might easily have led him to oppose the reformers, but he was never a diehard who rallied against change in any form. The only true conservative is the man who resolutely set his face to the future, he once told a progressive supporter. It was preoccupation with morality that had brought the reform movement together and which attracted Roosevelt to progressivism. His life, he felt, was a quest for the moral, wrote one biographer, John Bloom. The reformers of the early 20th century saw themselves rooting out evil, which, more often than not, they defined as corporate arrogance. Thus, when Roosevelt set out to bust the trust, he did not always pick the biggest corporations. Rather, he picked the more notorious companies like the Northern Securities Railroad Combination, whose reputation for stock manipulation and rate gouging against farmers and small shippers had outraged popular opinion. Corporate misconduct would not have spurred moral outrage, and the misconduct not frequently resulted in Corporate misconduct would not have spurred moral outrage had the misconduct not frequently resulted in tragedy. Seeking to maximize profits, a railroad might leave a road crossing unguarded. A water company might eliminate safeguards against typhoid fever. Such incidents made the corporation look like a killer, wrote historian David Thelen. These specific threats united all classes. Anyone's child might be careless at a railroad crossing, and typhoid fever was no respecter of social origins. The campaign for improved meat inspection had all the ingredients that aroused progressive ire. The packing industry fit Roosevelt's definition of a bad trust, since its disregard for even minimal health standards threatened all classes of Americans. The problem was particularly acute because the explosive growth of cities had created a huge demand for processed foods. Almost none of the food industries had better sanitary standards than the meatpackers. Milk dealers, for example, regularly increased their profits by diluting their product, using chalk, plaster, and molasses to fortify the color and taste. A popular ditty of the day expressed the widespread skepticism with processed foods. Things are seldom what they seem. Skim milk masquerades as cream. Lard and soap we eat for cheese. Butter is but axle grease. As a result, the public was prepared to think the worst of the meat industry. Reeling from the impact of the Sinclair scandal, the packers agreed that improved federal inspection was the best way to restore public confidence in their products. J. Ogden Armour, head of the packing house that bore his name, defended the industry in a Saturday Evening Post article published soon after The Jungle appeared. Armour confidently invited the public to visit local packing plants to see for yourself how the hated packer takes care of your meat supply. But he frankly admitted that no packer can do an interstate or export business without government inspection. A serious decline in both domestic and foreign meat sales confirmed Armour's estimate of the need for improved inspection. Under the shadow Sinclair had cast, millions of Americans had altered their eating habits. Many foreign countries banned American meats. An industry representative confessed that the loss of public confidence was hurting us very, very materially. Thus, the historical context surrounding the strident confrontation between reformers and packers reveals that the dramatic appearance of the Jungle was only the most conspicuous, and therefore the most obviously symbolic, event among a whole series of developments. All the necessary ingredients were on hand to produce legislation for more stringent federal inspection. And on hand was Theodore Roosevelt, the master political chef who could whip up all the ingredients into a dish consumers could taste with confidence. The legislative jungle. In order for public outrage to find constructive outlet, politicians must translate that anger into law. And historians, for their part, must retrace the same path through the congressional maze in order to see what compromises and deals shaped the final bill. The legislative process is so constituted that willful minorities can sometimes thwart the will of determined majorities. Skillful manipulation of parliamentary rules, the committee system, the party caucus, nuisance amendments, filibuster, and other legislative procedures, all of these allow senators and representatives to protect special interests, promote their own causes, or delay the legislative process until support for the bill dissolves. It is during the legislative phase that the historian discovers that support for improved inspection was not so universal as it seemed immediately after the publication of The Jungle. Meat inspection, like many reforms of the progressive era, raised issues more consequential than the sanitary standards of a single industry. Many of the larger issues affected the attitudes of the individual actors. President Roosevelt, for example, had on many occasions expressed his determination to assert the sovereignty of the national government by affirmative action against unchecked corporate wealth and power. When he added the Hepburn Bill, allowing the government to set railroad shipping rates, and the Pure Food and Drug Act, a new meat inspection bill would mark a major extension of public regulatory authority over private corporations. Many people who favored improved inspection had given no indication that they would accept Roosevelt's sweeping definition of executive authority. The popular doctrine, caveat emptor, let the buyer beware, placed the burden for policing the marketplace on the consumer, not the government. As recently as 1895, in the case of E.C. Knight, the Supreme Court had severely restricted the possible area of government regulation over commerce. The Packers, for their part, had given no indication that in agreeing to inspection reform, they would accept a bill that in any way impinged on their control of the meat industry. So behind the mask of general agreement, many actors entered the legislative process with conflicting motives and objectives. Much of that conflict would be expressed not as a disagreement on major legal or philosophical issues, but as seemingly petty bickering over procedural questions and minutiae of the proposed law. From the outset, Roosevelt indicated that he did not expect to achieve a satisfactory bill without a struggle. He knew that Sinclair's socialist writings would not persuade conservatives in Congress to support the tough bill he wanted, nor had the government yet taken adequate steps to investigate its own misconduct. Immediately after the furor over the ag jungle, Agricultural Secretary James Wilson had ordered an internal investigation of the Bureau of Animal Industry, which ran the inspection system. But Wilson and Roosevelt both suspected that the investigation would not get to the bottom of this matter. Therefore, they asked Commissioner of Labor Charles P. Neal and New York Attorney General James Reynolds to undertake an independent investigation. Both men had been active in good government causes, though neither had any familiarity with the meat industry. Once they reported back, Roosevelt would have the evidence he needed either to discredit Sinclair as a sensationalist or the meatpackers as malefactors of wealth. Agricultural Department investigators confirmed the president's cynicism by whitewashing the BAI. They charged Sinclair with grossly exaggerating conditions in the plants and treating the worst which could be found in any establishment as typical of the general conditions. Although they conceded that the system could stand reforming, they argued that Sinclair's accusations against federal inspectors were willful and deliberate misrepresentations of fact. Neal and Reynolds, the independent ones, suggested that, if anything, Sinclair understated the abominable conditions. Their official report rivaled his expose in lurid details. Slime and manure covered the walks leading into the plants. The buildings lacked adequate ventilation and lighting. All the equipment, the conveyors, meat racks, cutting blades, and tubs, rotted under a blanket of filth and blood. Meat scraps for canning or sausages sat in piles on the grimy floors. Large portions of ground rope and pigskins went into the potted ham. Just as Sinclair had charged, foul conditions in the plant proved harmful to the health of both the workers and the consumers of the products they prepared. The Neal-Reynolds report gave Roosevelt the big stick he liked to carry into any political fight. Should the Packers prove recalcitrant, he could threaten to make the secret report public. It is absolutely necessary that we shall have legislation which will prevent the reoccurrence of these wrongs, he warned. In Senator Albert Beveridge of Indiana, he found a willing ally, already at work on a new inspection bill. Beveridge, like Roosevelt, had caught the rising tide of progressive discontent over corporate misconduct. He sensed, too, that leadership on the issue would win him the popular acclaim he craved. Assisted by Agricultural Department experts, Beveridge had a bill drafted by the middle of May 1906. He urged Roosevelt to pave the way for Senate approval by releasing the damning Neal-Reynolds report. For the moment, the politically adept Roosevelt heeded his own admonition to speak softly. Despite his customary bluster and pugnacious temperament, the president was actually a cautious man. An unnecessary confrontation with the powerful beef trust offended his sense of political expedience. Why waste his political ammunition if he could have his way without a fight? The matter is of such far-reaching importance, he confided to Neal, that it is out of the question to act hastily. Besides, having once been a rancher himself, he was reluctant to injure the livestock raisers who bore no responsibility for the Packers' scandalous behavior. The Packers had indicated that they would resist efforts to regulate their business. While Neal and Reynolds were in Chicago, packing house representatives had privately admitted that all was not well in their plants. One had begged Neal to withhold his report, promising in return that the Packers would carry out any reasonable, rational, and just recommendations within 30 days. Please don't release that report. Look too bad. When Neal refused, Packer Lewis Swift rushed off to confront the president. He found Roosevelt equally unsympathetic to any scheme involving voluntary compliance. The president assured Swift that he would settle for no less than legislation to prevent the reoccurrence of these wrongs. Beveridge was now ready with his bill. On May 21st, he introduced it as a Senate amendment to the House Agricultural Appropriations Bill, a money budget bill. Why, might one ask, did such a major reform make its debut in the form of a tacked-on amendment to a House bill? Here we begin to see how the legislative process affects political outcomes. Beveridge recognized that the effective inspection required adequate funds. Previous Congresses had undermined the system by refusing to vote the money needed. Many smaller plants had no inspection at all, and the largest one had no inspectors at night. Beveridge, therefore, had proposed to shift the funding from the small amount allotted in the House Appropriations Bill to a head fee charged for each animal inspected. As the industry grew, so would the funds for the Bureau of Animal Industry. But since the Constitution requires the House of Representatives, to initiate all money bills, Beveridge had to amend the House bill pending before the Senate rather than introduce a separate measure, because then the House would have the power to defund it. Beveridge included two other important changes. The old law did nothing to enforce the packers to indicate on the label of canned meats and either the date on which they were processed or the actual contents. Neal and Reynolds, for example, discovered that the product called potted chicken contained no chicken at all. The new law required dating and accurate labeling of the contents. It also invested the Secretary of Agriculture with broad authority to establish regulations for sanitary standards in the plants. Inspectors could therefore then enforce those conditions, as well as the health of animals prior to and after slaughtering. If the owners challenged an inspector's ruling, the Secretary had authority to make a final conclusive ruling. Yet this comprehensive bill, which Beveridge confidently introduced in May, was hardly the same bill Roosevelt signed on June 30th, 1906. The small head fee had been replaced by an annual $3 million appropriation. The Secretary of Agriculture no longer had final and conclusive authority, for the federal courts were given the right to review his rulings. And the final measure said nothing about dated canned meats. In these discrepancies undoubtedly lies the source of Senator Nelson's dismay with the outcome of the meat inspection battle. What the historian must now explain is why the reformers entered the fray holding most of the cards in their hands, and they had given in on so many crucial points. Why did they do this? Why did this awesome bill come in so watered down in the end? The battle actually began well enough for Roosevelt and Senate reformers. When the Packers first tried to stall Beveridge with promises to make voluntary improvements, the senator threatened them with more damaging disclosures. We'll show the public all your crap. To show he meant business, he had Neal brief lobbyists for livestock raisers and senators from western cattle states on the contents of his report. Here's what we got. The Packers had counted on those men as allies in the fight against overly stringent federal regulation. But faced with the prospect of more adverse publicity, the meat and cattle interests began a hot retreat. The Beveridge Amendment passed in the Senate without a single negative vote. Never known for his modesty, Beveridge touted his measure as the most perfect inspection bill in the world. Roosevelt hoped that the smashing Senate victory would lead to equally swift action in the House. The bill has to pass through the House and Senate to get passed, so it's passed the Senate, now it has to go to the House. The Packers, however, had no intention of giving up without a fight. In the House of Representatives, they had far more substantial support, particularly on the critical Agricultural Committee. Its chairman, James Wadsworth, a Republican from New York, was himself a cattle breeder. He regarded The Jungle as, quote, a horrid, untruthful book, which he claimed had temporarily unhinged the president. To orchestrate his opposition, Wadsworth could count on the unflagging support of Blond Billy Lorimer, a senior committee member, notorious grafter, and the Republican representative from Chicago's Packing House District. The Beveridge bill aroused Lorimer like a red flag waved before a bull. This bill will never be reported by my committee, not if Little Willie can help it. The Packers had another, even more powerful ally, time. Summer recess for Congress was only 6 weeks away. In the days before air conditioning, most public officials left Washington to escape the oppressive summer heat. While Congress vacationed, the public would most likely forget all about the jungle, and as popular outrage dissipated, so would much of the pressure for reform. Only new and more damaging disclosures could rekindle the fervor that had swept Beveridge's amendment through the Senate. So long as the Neil Reynolds report remained secret, Roosevelt could save it as the ultimate disclosure to arouse the public. He'd use it as a weapon. But by the time the beverage bill reached the House, the impatient Upton Sinclair had reneged on an earlier promise to Roosevelt that he would remain silent until his accusations had been proven. To go to the president, he published the new charges embellished with even more lurid details. Finally, unable to contain his frustration, he leaked the details of the Neil Reynolds report to the New York Times, and newspapers across the country had picked up the story. Having lost its shock value, Roosevelt's big stick appeared more like a little twig. The packing house forces sensed that the worst had passed and set out to delay a vote on the beverage bill until they had forced the reformers to make 3 concessions they viewed as crucial to their interest, the meatpacking interests. The requirement for stringent labeling, they argued, would force the industry to abandon many well-known brand names, and dates would prejudice consumers against perfectly healthy canned meats. So no labeling. Nor could the packers abide investing such broad discretionary powers in the Secretary of Agriculture. Such a step, one spokesman claimed, would in effect put our business in the hands of theorists, chemists, and sociologists, etc., and the management and control taken away from men who devoted their lives to the upbuilding and perfecting of this great American industry. In short, the packers argued that the Secretary's arbitrary authority could deprive them of their property without the constitutional safeguard of due process in the courts. So no labeling, and they were against the Secretary of Agriculture regulating them. Although likely to gain materially from more effective inspection, the packers called the head fees the most unfair aspect of the bill. Condemned animals, they claimed, already cost them millions each year. Now the government proposed to saddle them with an additional burden of paying inspectors' salaries. That argument artfully concealed the packers' real opposition to a self-financing system. As many reformers quickly pointed out, the small head fee, no more than 3 to 5 cents per animal, could easily be passed on to consumers. But a more effective inspection service might force the packers to abandon some of their most profitable, if unhealthy, practices, such as rerouting cattle rejected at ante-mortem inspection to other parts of their plants. Furthermore, the old law allowed the packers to undermine the inspection system whenever it hurt profits, simply by arranging for their congressional allies, Lorimer and Wadsworth, to cut the BAI budget in the name of government economy. Forced to lay off inspectors, the BAA could not effectively supervise the plants. The beverage head fee system eliminated that possibility and made it more possible to have more inspectors. When the packers waged their lobbying campaign, they shrewdly pitched their arguments to congressional interests as well as their own. Control over annual appropriations gives the House and its members much of their political clout. By making his system self-financing, Beveridge would have weakened the House's jealously guarded grip on federal purse strings, depriving some congressmen of potential influence. Other representatives who were traditional champions of private enterprise agreed that restrictions on labels and dates, combined with the Secretary of Agriculture's discretionary authority, constituted unwarranted government interference in private enterprise. They were favors of laissez-faire. Beveridge had unwittingly reinforced his opponent's claims when he boasted that the bill was the most pronounced extension of federal power in every direction ever enacted. So laissez-faire people are like, oh my God, this could never pass. Representative E.D. Crumpacker of Indiana warned House members the passage of the meat inspection bill as it came from the Senate would mean the ultimate federalization of every industry in the United States. With substantial support in the House and the sting removed from the damning McNeil-Reynolds report, the packers sponsored a substitute bill, which Wadsworth and Lorimer introduced in the House in late May. These are the meat packers' allies. They introduced their own bill. Their draft eliminated each feature the packers opposed. So whatever the meat packers were against, they just got rid of it. They authorized the continued use of misleading brand names and preservatives. Dates on the cans were not required. In place of the head fee, they had restored the annual appropriation. And in 2 other sweeping revisions, they removed the beverage bill's proposed ban on interstate transportation of uninspected meats and gave packing firms the right to appeal any agricultural department ruling to the federal courts. That last provision promised to be the most destructive of all, for private business had no more sympathetic audience than the champions of laissez-faire who sat on the federal judiciary. By appealing each unfavorable decision to the courts, the packers could paralyze the inspection system. The Wadsworth-Lorimer substitute outraged President Roosevelt. It seems to me, he wrote Wadsworth, that each change is for the worse, and in the aggregate they are ruinous, taking every particle of good from the suggested Beveridge Amendment. He then made good on his threat to expose the packers. On June 4th, he sent the McNeil report to Congress along with a sharply worded message calling for a stringent inspection bill. As might have been expected, Roosevelt's message in no way routed the packing house forces in the House. Lorimer returned from a hasty trip to Chicago in time to denounce the Neil Reynolds report as a gross exaggeration of conditions. Armour accused the president of doing everything in his power to discredit them and their business. The Packers even produced 2 University of Illinois professors to rebut the Neil Reynolds report. All of that rhetoric, of course, is a part of the symbolic language that so often monopolizes the stage of politics. Each side adopts an uncompromising posture and accuses the opposition of all manner of villainy. The combatants strike heroic postures as champions of a larger public or national interest. They use such, quote, disinterested allies as Neil and Reynolds or university professors to legitimize their position. But at this point, when no accommodation seems possible, the negotiation and compromise begin. Faced with Roosevelt's demand for quick action on the beverage bill and the Wadsworth-Lorimer substitute, the House voted to send both measures to the Agricultural Committee. In doing so, it followed a well-established procedure for reviewing legislation through its committee system. No handbook exists that explains how the committee system works, nor does the Constitution make any mention of it. Congress first established committees to streamline its functioning. Rather than have the entire body deliberate every bill, these smaller groups consider measures relevant to their areas of special interest before making recommendations to the entire House or Senate. A trade bill may go to the Commerce or Foreign Relations Committee, a pork barrel water project to the Rivers and Harbors Committee, and a farm bill to the Agriculture Committee. Those bills encompassing a variety of features have to go through several committees. All bills must eventually pass through the Rules Committee, which establishes parliamentary rules such as the time allotted for floor debate or the conditions for the amendment. Yet, if the committee system promotes efficiency, it also can become an undemocratic process used by a handful of representatives or senators to defeat a popular bill, either by eliminating or amending its central provisions, or by refusing to return it to the floor for a vote. In sending the beverage bill to the Agricultural Committee, the House had routed it through an enemy stronghold. Wadsworth and Lorimer were both members of the committee. They had only to gain 10 of 18 votes from their colleagues in order to replace the beverage bill with their substitute. Other members of the House might never have a chance to even vote on the original bill, even if a majority favored it. Diligently, Wadsworth and Lorimer set out to undermine the beverage bill. They opened their attack by holding committee hearings to which they invited only witnesses sympathetic to the Packers. Hearings are ostensibly a means to collect information that guides Congress as it formulates legislation, but they can be used for many other purposes, to delay, to discredit opponents, or to gain publicity for committee members. So for 4 days, the Agricultural Committee heard a parade of witnesses defend the Packers. The testimony of Thomas Wilson, a leading Packer lobbyist, set the tone. Fed leading questions by Lorimer and Wadsworth, he attacked the Neil Reynolds report as a compendium of inaccuracies of fact, impunged the two men's competence, and stressed the non-practical nature of their background. And though under oath, Wilson swore that no condemned meat ever entered the market. The Packers, he explained, were reasonable, public-spirited men. They would support a fair measure such as Wadsworth and Lorimer had proposed, but not the government interference Beveridge called for. More moderate committee members finally insisted that the committee hear opposing witnesses as well. That suited Wadsworth and Lorimer, for the longer the hearings lasted, the closer Congress came to recessing for the summer. They also gained an opportunity to confront Neil and Reynolds directly. Neil attempted to refute criticism of his impracticality by stating that we only reported what we could see, hear, and smell. He soon withered, however, under an unending barrage of hostile questions from the chairman and his crony. Reynolds, the Washington lawyer, was more accustomed to such abusive tactics. He coolly pointed out that while he had based his conclusions on direct observation, Wilson had relied solely on hearsay gathered from the packing house employees. As the hearings closed on June 13th, Wadsworth eked out a narrow margin of victory, his substitute bill passing by only 11-7. 4 Republicans were so disgusted by the bully-ragging aimed at Neil and Reynolds that they voted against the substitute. The president exploded when he saw Wadsworth's handiwork. The provisions in the new bill struck him as so bad that if they had been deliberately designed to prevent remedying of the evils complained of, they could not have been worse. Historians recognize that parties to a negotiation often inflate their initial demands to allow room for compromise. Still, Wadsworth and Lorimer had been unusually brazen in attacking the heart of Beveridge's inspection system. In their substitute, they made no provision for night inspection. Lorimer had also included a clause that waived for 1 year the civil service requirements for new inspectors. In that year, he could personally control the list of new appointments. the BAI would be saddled with political hacks loyal only to Lorimer and the Packers. Two provisions particularly infuriated Roosevelt. The Agricultural Department had suggested as a compromise that Congress authorize an annual appropriation, but also grant the Secretary standby power to levy a head fee if the appropriation proved inadequate. Lorimer and Wadsworth insisted on the annual sum of $1 million, scarcely enough to meet current costs. And once again, they had shifted final authority under the Act from the Secretary of Agriculture to the federal courts. The President did not deny that the Packers, like anyone else, were entitled to due process, but he also believed that the court review should be restricted to a narrow procedural question. Had the Secretary been fair in reaching his decision? The committee granted the courts power to rule on the substantive questions of fact. You would have the functions of the Secretary of Agriculture narrowly limited so as to be purely ministerial, Roosevelt told Wadsworth, and when he declared a given slaughterhouse unsanitary or a given product unwholesome, acting upon the judgment of government experts, you would put on a judge who had no knowledge of conditions the burden of stating whether the Secretary was right. Wadsworth refused to be cowed by the President's angry outburst. You are wrong, very, very wrong in your estimate of the committee's bill, he responded. He even criticized the President for impugning the sincerity and the competency of a committee on the House of Representatives and called this substitute measure a perfect piece of legislation to carry into effect your own views on this question as it was ever prepared by a committee of Congress. Lorimer, too, vowed to continue his defiance of the President. All that sniping would not deserve so much notice except for one important factor. All the antagonists belonged to the same party. The meat inspection battle had pitted a popular and powerful Republican president and his Senate friends against the Republican majority in the House. Senator Henry Cabot Lodge of Massachusetts, perhaps the president's closest political friend, had made the intra-party schism that much more public when he denounced the greedy Packers for their attempt to derail the reform bill. Sensing the growing embarrassment among Republicans, House Democrats sought to deepen the rift. They insisted that the beverage bill be given a full vote on the House floor, even though it had not been voted out of the Agricultural Committee. Czar Joseph Cannon, the dictatorial Republican Speaker of the House, temporarily revived the situation for his party by ruling the motion out of order. Cannon was now the man on the hot seat, the Speaker of the House. The fight among Republican factions threatened to become a Donnybrook that might destroy the political empire he had so ruthlessly built and ruled. His personal and political sympathies lay with the Packers and the conservatives who opposed the government regulation of the free enterprise system. His power came, however, not from leading any particular faction, but from bringing together all the elements of his party into a unified machine. As Speaker and Chairman of the powerful Rules Committee, he had the means to keep unruly congressmen in line because he handed out all the committee assignments. Members of Congress prefer to sit on those committees that deal with issues important to their constituents. Industrial state representatives may want labor or commerce, while a representative from a mining state like Nevada might prefer interior, like the mining committee. To earn Cannon's favor, many representatives found themselves forced to vote with the Speaker and against their consciences. With his power base shaken, Cannon sought some way to break the impasse between Republican reformers and conservatives. Since Roosevelt, too, had interest in party unity, the Speaker went to see him at the White House. The President proved amenable to a suitable compromise. They agreed that Wisconsin Representative Henry Adams, a moderate and a member of the Agricultural Committee, was the best person to work out the details. Adams had endorsed earlier compromises, and as a former food commissioner and champion of pure food legislation, he was freed of the taint that clung to the Wadsworth-Lorimer. Adams, Reynolds, and Agricultural Department lawyers had soon produced a new bill. From the Wadsworth-Lorimer measure, they dropped the civil service waiver, added a provision for dating canned meats, and gave the Secretary standby fee authority, and eliminated the section on broad court review. Roosevelt declared their measure as good as the Beveridge Amendment. All those negotiations took place while Wadsworth and Lorimer were away from Washington, but when they returned, they vowed to reverse the President's apparent victory. Cannon, the Speaker of the House, however, had no appetite for further infighting. He urged the Agricultural Committee to work out yet another compromise. Wadsworth and Lorimer immediately deleted the Secretary's standby fee authority from the Adams bill, though they did raise the appropriation to $3 million, more than enough to meet current costs. Their acts next fell on the dating requirement, and in return they kept out the civil service waiver while explicitly authorizing inspectors to visit plants day or night. One crucial issue remained. What would be the scope of court review? Wadsworth was willing to drop his demand for a broad review if the President took out the Senate's phrase giving the Secretary, quote, final and conclusive authority. Roosevelt agreed to that horse trade, which one historian aptly described as purposeful obscurity. To achieve his larger goal of improved inspection, Roosevelt was willing to let the courts decide the actual scope of judicial review. He regretted the absence of mandatory dating, but did not consider the issue sufficiently important to upset the hard-won compromise. Roosevelt often criticized those diehards who would go down fighting for a whole loaf when half a loaf was the best they could expect. With the president behind the final committee bill, the entire House passed it on June 19th. The battle was not yet won, however, for Beveridge and the reformers in the Senate continued their fight, threatening to keep the two houses deadlocked until recess. The Indiana senator had strong support from Redfield Proctor, chairman of the Senate Agricultural Committee. Now we're in the Senate, not the House. Though nearly crippled by rheumatism, Proctor had stayed on in Washington to assure passage of an effective meat bill. Like Beveridge, he believed a consumer had the right to know whether canned meats were 5 days or 5 years old, and if the government stamp would be worth millions in free advertising for the packers, Proctor thought the industry, not the taxpayer, should bear the cost. The Senate therefore voted to reject the House bill in favor of its own. Once again, process more than substance determined the outcome. When the two houses passed different versions of the same bill, they created a conference committee to iron out the discrepancies. With time too short for long wrangling over each point, Roosevelt intervened. He first urged the House members to reconsider their positions on dating and fees. They refused so vehemently that Roosevelt turned to the Senate conferees instead. Proctor and Beveridge recognized that further resistance meant total defeat. On June 29th, the day before adjournment, they raised the white flag to make sure of the greater good, and the Senate passed the House bill. The next day after Roosevelt signed it, the Meat Inspection Act of 1906 became the law of the land. Out of the jungle? We might think that the passage of the new act was cause to uncork the champagne for celebration. Despite their opposition to certain compromises, Roosevelt and Beveridge had endorsed the final measure as a triumph for reform. If historians let the case rest here, however, they would not know whether to accept Roosevelt and Beveridge's enthusiasm or Newt Nelson's despair. Who, after all, had won this legislative battle? Certainly, reformers would be heartened to see that the old toothless law had been replaced by a system that required day and night inspection. It banned uninspected meats from interstate commerce, gave the Secretary authority to establish sanitary standards, and provided ample funding for the immediate future, at least. Yet the bill contained no provision for head fees or dating, and still left the courts as the final judge of the Secretary of Agricultural's rulings, which, as we know, the courts were very pro-business, pro-meatpackers. In determining who could claim victory, Roosevelt, Beveridge, and Nelson had to base their judgment only on the provisions of the final act. Yet the real significance of legislation cannot be determined until its effectiveness in practice has been measured. A law must be applied by the executive branch and tested in the courts. In the case of the Meat Inspection Act, future presidents might appoint agricultural secretaries sympathetic to packers. The standards established might either be too vague or too lax to enforce proper sanitation. More important, the courts might yet call Roosevelt's bluff and intercept their prerogative for review broadly. Only after observing the operation of the new system over time can the historian decide whether the compromises vindicated Roosevelt or proved half a loaf worse than none at all. As it happens, the subsequent history of meat inspection confirms the wisdom of the president's compromise strategy. The $3 million appropriation more than adequately funded the beefed-up inspection system. By the end of 1907, Secretary Wilson reported that new and more efficient procedures had substantially reduced operating costs. The BAI spent only $2 million the first year, and costs dropped even though the industry grew. Roosevelt had been shrewdest in his resort to purposeful obscurity. The packers made no attempt to dismantle the inspection system in the courts. The first important case did not arise for over 10 years. Then, in 1917, in the U.S. v. Cuddy Packing Company, a federal judge affirmed the Secretary's authority. Congress, he ruled, could delegate authority to the proper administrative officer to make effective rules. 2 years later, the Supreme Court adopted narrow rather than broad review. In an opinion for a unanimous court in the case of Houston versus the St. Louis Independent Packing Company, Justice John Clark wrote that a decision over proper labeling of meat is a question of fact, the determination of which is committed to the Secretary of Agriculture, and the law is that the conclusion of the head of the executive department will not be reviewed by the courts, where it is fairly arrived at with substantial report. So the Secretary of Agriculture can regulate. After 13 years, the reformers could finally claim victory, though the outcome by then was scarcely in doubt. Not until 1968 did another generation of reformers, spurred by Ralph Nader, find it necessary to launch a campaign to strengthen the inspection system. Then they sought higher standards for meats subject only to state inspection. The controversy over meat inspection reminds the historian that when a legislative issue involves the disposition of economic and political power, all three branches of government influence the outcome. That does not mean, however, that their roles are equal. In this case, a politically shrewd and popular executive, the president, had shown greater capacity to affect the political process at critical moments. Roosevelt used the power of his office, his control over the Republican Party, and his ability to generate publicity to overcome opposition on both sides. Beveridge admitted that even in the face of widespread public outrage, Congress would not have acted if the president had not picked up his big stick and smashed the Packers with their agents in the House and Senate over the head of it. Yet Roosevelt prevailed in the end only because he recognized compromise as an essential feature of the political process. He had yielded on points he considered less consequential in order to achieve his larger objective. Just as historians might expand their field of vision to weigh the effects on a law of all three branches of government, so too must they establish the historical context of a bill over time. As we discovered, the meat scandal had a long history before the publication of the Jungle. We discovered, too, near unanimous support for stricter inspection, though little understanding of what form a new bill might take. Only when the bill made its way through the legislative process did we find that the widespread cry for reform masked a deep conflict over the roles of private and public agencies in determining satisfactory standards. The Packers wanted the benefits of a new bill without having to relinquish control over any aspect of their business. In addition to chastening the Packers, the reformers sought to assert the authority of the federal government to police corporate arrogance. The success of their efforts remained in doubt until well after the bill's enactment, when the Supreme Court adopted the narrow review. It becomes clear then why the Meat Inspection Act could generate both Beveridge's enthusiasm and Nelson's dismay. All the interested parties had gained some, though not all, of their objectives. With public confidence restored, the Packers could anticipate renewed growth for their industry. Reformers could, however, hold them to higher standards of accountability. The Republicans had averted a destructive intra-party battle and had emerged as spokesmen for the public interest despite Wadsworth and Lorimer, who were the hacks for the Packers. Roosevelt had strengthened his authority over the party while extending the scope of his executive authority. Above all, he had demonstrated a capacity for effective leadership. The public gained, too, for they could sit down to dinner having to worry less what their canned foods contained besides meat. The Meat Inspection Act of 1906 had been a total victory for neither the reformers nor the Packers. As is so often the case, the political system achieved results only after the visible symbols and myths of public discourse have been negotiated, debated, and compromised in the procedural tangle at the heart of the legislative process. Gone from our analysis are those wonderful symbols of corporate villainy and presidential heroism. But in their place, we have a more complex story revealing the political process that shapes our history.